The first thing you hear is the silence of no shooting, and then the people moving, coming out, people coming back, looking for the dead, getting an exchange of prisoners, injured prisoners, etc. Food. Once you get them to stop shooting, get normality going, these are the first indications of your progress in peacekeeping. People throughout the world want peace. They want to rear their kids, send them to school, better their conditions, make some money to look after them, develop their housing, etc.
Niittala, Finland. Soldiers from Nordic countries train for service as United Nations peacekeepers.
First of all, is it outside the area of separation, or is it inside the area of separation?
It was outside the area of separation.
Okay.
There may seem to be a contradiction in training soldiers to wage peace, not war. But this concept is at the heart of United Nations peacekeeping.
Your task is to patrol the road marked on the map.
Although peacekeeping may be the single greatest innovation of the United Nations, its history and development remain largely unknown. Nevertheless, the blue helmet has become the symbol of the World Organization's efforts to preserve peace.
Peacekeeping is a technical term. It means the use of multinational forces under international command to help control and resolve conflicts. It takes place with the consent of the parties. That's a central feature of peacekeeping. So you've got to start with, you've got to have some kind of agreement between the parties to a conflict.
It all begins here, United Nations headquarters, New York City. Peacekeeping has never been easy, as the world has shifted from crisis to crisis since the United Nations founding in 1945.
The SLA shelled Nabatea and killed 4 people this morning. And it's outside the uniform area of operations, but it's something which we may have to take up with the Israelis.
Each morning, a group of UN officials confers on the status of 9 peacekeeping missions, involving over 10,000 soldiers around the world. On the border between Iran and Iraq, United Nations observers monitor a truce, negotiated after a long and destructive war. In Namibia, United Nations police monitors patrol the countryside, ensuring that human rights are respected by the local police. In Afghanistan, UN observers monitor the withdrawal of Soviet military personnel, ending a 10-year occupation. And in Cyprus, peacekeepers patrol the buffer zone separating the rival Greek and Turkish communities.
The peacekeepers are lightly armed for self-protection and only fire in defense of their own lives or their comrades' lives as a last resort. Now this helps them from many points of view, because it gives a moral suasion to that force.
United Nations peacekeeping was given new momentum with the awarding of the 1988 Nobel Peace Prize. Secretary General Javier Perez de Cuellar accepted the award on behalf of all UN peacekeepers since 1948.
It was overdue. When you realize the number of people who are working with the United Nations in order to preserve peace is really remarkable. And to see soldiers working for peace is something which is extremely inspiring.
Today, United Nations peacekeeping has become a useful tool for reducing tensions. But this was not always the case. And the history of peacekeeping is one with roots in nearly a century of devastating wars. With the horrors of World War I fresh in their minds, the founders of the League of Nations in 1919 attempted to create a forum where nations could subject their disputes to peaceful settlement. However, since all League Council decisions had to be unanimous, the organization became little more than a debating society. The fate of the League was sealed in 1936 when it failed to prevent Italy's conquest of Ethiopia. In 1939, the dream of peace was crushed under the weight of German tanks. The world was again plunged into war.
The dramatic conference for which the world has watched and waited. Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill.
Long before World War II ended, the soon-to-be victorious Allies were planning a strategy to avoid future conflicts.
Diplomatic representatives of the three nations are present.
It was in San Francisco in 1945 that delegates from 50 nations came together to draft the UN Charter. Unlike the League of Nations, the United Nations incorporated in its charter a provision for international forces to prevent war and ensure that another Hitler would never again rise to power. The 5 victorious allies would each have a permanent seat on the Security Council responsible for keeping the peace.
There were many who doubted that agreement could ever be reached by these 50 countries, differing so much. But these differences were all forgotten in one unshakable unity of determination to find a way to end war.
Well, it was very exciting because, of course, we all believed that things were going to change for the better, that we were going to organize the world in a better way, that we were going to get away from war and so on. And this lasted for about 5 months. There was an enormous euphoria.
Brian Urquhart, a former British Army officer, was one of the UN's first staff employees. Until his retirement in 1986, he was a principal player in the evolution of UN peacekeeping, eventually overseeing all United Nations forces as the Undersecretary General for Special Political Affairs.
We started with peacekeeping in 1948, as a matter of fact. In Palestine and in Kashmir, there were 2 wars, one between India and Pakistan and one between the new state of Israel and the surrounding Arab states. And both came to a halt with international arrangements for a ceasefire.
Grim climax of tragedy in the Holy Land. 2 truckloads of explosives blown up in the heart of Jerusalem's business section, killing almost 60 persons and wrecking some 1,000 buildings.
In 1948, it was becoming clear to the world community that the Jews and Arabs of Palestine would be unable to peacefully coexist.
The loss of life in the Holy Land must be brought to an immediate end. The maintenance of international peace is at stake.
The United Nations constructed a plan to partition the former British colony into Jewish and Arab states. After the Arabs rejected the plan, Israel declared independence on May 14, 1948. 1 day later, 5 Arab countries attacked the new nation.
The mediator in Palestine, who was then Count Bernadotte, then immediately went to the area with Ralph Bunche, who was his deputy, and the Security Council declared a truce. Their job was to get that in place, and their second job was to negotiate the settlement, which, curiously enough, we all thought was quite an easy thing to do in 1948. I don't know why we thought that, but we did. Nobody had foreseen the enormous difficulty of doing this.
An already difficult situation became worse when Count Bernadotte was assassinated by members of the Stern Gang, a militant Zionist organization, propelling his young American deputy, Ralph Bunche, into the position of chief mediator. This role would earn him the Nobel Peace Prize in 1950.
Ralph Bunche was a central figure in establishing the notion and then elaborating the means of United Nations effective peacekeeping. He was immensely resourceful in dealing with implacable enemies, getting the various Arabs together and getting them together with the Israelis was quite a feat.
These successful armistice negotiations have demonstrated conclusively the ability of the United Nations to mediate a serious conflict.
Bunch very soon realized that if you had a war between 5 Arab states on the one side and Israel on the other, it was so complicated that it wasn't any good just telling them to stop fighting. That wouldn't happen. You had to have people on the ground to try to pin the truce down. So they recruited a number of military officers, put them in with UN armbands and told them to go off and supervise the terms of the truce.
Trygve Lie, Secretary General of the United Nations, bids farewell to the 49-man group of international police, leaving for duty at his request to enforce armistice conditions in Palestine. Recruited from 7 nations, the men are all volunteers and constitute the nucleus of what may eventually be a guard force of 5,000 United Nations soldiers. These are the first soldiers in the Army of Peace.
The United Nations Truce Supervision Organization, UNTSO, was responsible for monitoring the ceasefire lines between Israel and its Arab neighbors. The observers carried no weapons and were expected to keep the peace with little more than a pair of binoculars. This was a hastily improvised operation, and the unarmed UN observers had little power other than to observe troop movements and ceasefire violations. In fact, after 1950, the UN found it increasingly difficult to keep the peace along Israel's borders.
You know, when UN was started in San Francisco and started and launched by the nations on the western side after the Second World War, and their concept was to establish a full-time UN army for the enforcement of peace. That is, deciding there was going to be peace and to enforce it by military means. Of course, that concept came unstuck very, very quickly when the Cold War started, because to enforce peace you had to have agreement in the Security Council. And when the Cold War was introduced, it was difficult to get peace on anything, or agreement on anything. So that whole concept, you might say, went out the window.
In 1950, the Soviets attempted to seat the People's Republic of China instead of Nationalist China on the Security Council. After the Western powers blocked this effort, the Soviets staged a series of walkouts, leaving their council seat vacant. On June 25, 1950, troops from North Korea invaded South Korea, setting in motion a grave international crisis. With the Soviets absent from the Security Council, the Western powers were able to authorize a United Nations force to oppose the invasion.
The Russians weren't there to veto it. Had they been there to veto it, who knows what might have happened. But the United States picked up the ball at once and said, we will send forces. And it went into the General Assembly, and there was another act in the Security Council which gave the United States the command of the United Nations forces in Korea, a command which it still exercises.
The only reason for the action which was taken on advice of all the brains that I could muster was hoping, always hoping, that we'll finally arrive at the peace in the world which we anticipated when we created the United Nations. That's the only reason for the action. Thank you very much.
The United Nations operation, comprised primarily of United States military forces on the U.S. Military Command, was able to halt the invasion of North Korean troops at the 38th parallel. But this would be the only time the UN would carry out the kind of enforcement action envisioned in the Charter, and the last time any permanent member would absent itself from Security Council deliberations. The Korean War signaled the end of Trygve Lie's career as Secretary General. Shunned by the Soviet Union for his support of the Korean operation, Lie resigned in 1952 and was succeeded by Dag Hammarskjöld.
You are going to take over the most impossible job on earth. But I wish you all luck and all the best.
Thank you very much for those kind words.
Dag Hammarskjöld was a man with a as one saw later on, was sort of a mystical drive, which was unsuspected when he was appointed Secretary General. Everyone thought that they were getting a very safe Swedish civil servant, and they didn't realize that this was a man with an inner life which drove him beyond any sort of normal political influence.
He had a sort of visionary streak. I mean, he was looking not just to the day-to-day developments, but how you would push the idea of a world organization into the future and make it more relevant.
In a desperate effort to head off a dangerous threat to world peace, Dag Hammarskjöld, Secretary General of the United Nations, arrives on the scene to obtain the facts at first hand, and if possible to arrange a durable...
In 1956, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal Company, which had been controlled by British and French interests, and closed the Gulf of Aqaba to Israeli vessels. Israel, England, and France acted quickly to protect their interests. Israel invaded the Sinai, England and France bombed Port Said and parachuted military forces onto Egyptian soil. At Nasser's request, the Soviet Union dispatched military advisors. The possibility of an East-West global confrontation became frighteningly real. Because of a French and English veto, the Security Council was deadlocked. The General Assembly, in special session, called for a ceasefire and directed Hammarskjöld to come up with a plan to implement its resolution.
For the setting up, with the consent of the nations concerned, of an emergency international United Nations force.
It was then put forward by Lester Pearson of Canada and Dag Hammarskjöld that a peacekeeping force be introduced. And they called it actually at that time not even a peacekeeping force, they called it an emergency force. That's why the title of the first UN peacekeeping operation is called the United Nations Emergency Force, UNEF.
I only wish to express my warm hope that a decision in line with my proposals will be taken promptly so as to permit us to get going.
It was a test of both his negotiating skill and his practical ability as an administrator, because he had simultaneously to negotiate the withdrawal of the British and the French, and also set up something that was completely new, which was the United Nations Emergency Force, which had never been done before, and a lot of people thought wasn't possible.
This was the mission that defined United Nations peacekeeping. The military units under UN command would carry light weapons, only to be used in self-defense. This was not to be an occupying force. Soldiers would remain on Egyptian soil only as long as Egypt consented. With the deployment of UNEF, the Suez Canal and Gulf of Aqaba were reopened to international shipping, and Israeli forces withdrew from their positions in the Sinai Desert. UN forces filled the gap, patrolling a buffer zone between Israel and Egypt.
Historically, the United Nations helped to consolidate Israel during the 11 years in which the United Nations Emergency Force held its positions in the Straits of Tiran, in the Gulf of Aqaba, and in the Gaza Strip, a period of unexampled progress and consolidation of Israel, during which not a single shot was exchanged between Israel and Egypt over 11 years. What was wrong, of course, as I said in the Security Council at the time, was the manner in which the United Nations departed. Nothing became it less than the manner of its departure, but there were 11 years which did enable Israel to grow stronger in every sense of the word.
I left to go to serve in the United Nations Emergency Force in 1960, and our job was to patrol the first 23 miles on the frontier between Egypt and Israel.